Welcome, everyone. So I am Elizabeth Blythe, and this presentation is about giving you a framework to be able to predict the future and maybe forestall problems that could occur. Just to give you a little bit of background around myself, I have been delivering projects for 15 years. I started off at National Australia Bank, then I moved to IBM, and I worked in very large corporate settings for a long time until 2018 when I decided to, on a whim, apply to a job in games off of Twitter. And that kind of ended that, and I've been in games for about 5 years now. You can see here a little bit of the credentials and the training and education that I have, which hopefully gives you a sense of comfort that I know what I'm talking about. But I would actually really like to know a little bit about the composition of this audience so I can kind of think about what was the best thing to speak on. So firstly, how many of you are not producers who are in the room? Okay. Oh, wow, that's very interesting. Welcome then. I hope that this information really helps you. Of those of you who are producers, how many of you have been doing it for more than 10 years? Oh, wow, excellent. Okay. 8 years? 5? 2? We've got a great mix and some very, very experienced people in the room, and I would love to hear from you as well if you have any thoughts towards the end. Thank you very much for participating in my little understanding of who I'm talking to. This is a framework talk, and the way that I like to look at this is what are the key performance indicators that I am monitoring on a cyclical basis, and for me it's usually weekly, to understand the position that I'm in my project, and then to perform a gap analysis between what it is that I need to achieve and how I keep those KPIs under control that helps me crystallize the actions that I need to take to solve the problem before that little problem becomes a big issue. And so I can actually see that if I don't do something now, that key performance indicator is going to change, not for the better, and then that will give me the actions that I can take right now to prevent future activities. So I have 7 that I always track no matter what. And then depending on the project, I may add additional ones. So the 7 that I always track are schedule related, the capacity that I have to deliver, whether or not my stakeholders, and usually stakeholders are people outside of my team who are interacting with my team, whether or not they're engaged and supportive, the team's performance, whether or not we have all the skills we need, morale and whatnot, whether or not the risks are identified and managed, whether or not I have my issues tracked and are they closing, and whether or not this project is still in alignment with the reason that the company wanted to do the alignment in the first place. And then here's the other caveat: anything else I need. So in games, this has started to look like tracking all the assets in the game and understanding to what degree of delivery that they're at. It has also included things like when we were releasing mobile games, what is our application not responding rate, because Google would put us down in featuring if we didn't keep that up. So we would actually report on that to see whether or not it was meeting the standards that we needed within the studio. Another thing that I like to track, game health. And in some cases, there may be KPIs that external stakeholders care about. So part of the stakeholder engagement may be, am I caring about the things that my stakeholders think are important? So I'm going to go through each of these, and I'm actually going to show you a physical, real example. This is from a game that was delivered. On my left-hand side, that very first column was the current status. And I was using a RAG system. For me, RAG stands for red, amber, green. I think the A is just a conceit as opposed to saying yellow, because you can't spell RAG with a Y. But what I would say is that green for me means everything on this key performance indicator is going well. Amber would mean that there is some risk on this indicator, but it's under my control, and I feel like I can resolve the issue within my own authority. Red means I need help and I'm seeking assistance. So the leftmost column is my current, and my previous, or the second column that's slightly one step right is what it was the previous reporting cycle. So I can start to see, am I trending that I'm getting better, or am I actually getting worse on that indicator? the next column there, you can kind of see that I have like an overall statement. You have what the indicator is, and you could see a write-up, like my commentary of what I'm actually thinking about that indicator. And I know that it seems a little bit trite, but the action of writing up why I think it's red, or why I think it's amber, or why I think it's green, starts to crystallize the situation in my mind. And then the very last column is what I call a return to green. This is a discipline that I learned at IBM, and whereas IBM was probably the least favorite of all of the jobs I have ever had, I learned so much about process and discipline in a very large company. The purpose of imagining what has to happen to return an indicator to green not only tells me what I need to do, it tells everyone else in the project exactly what needs to happen, and it aligns everybody to the focus of what needs to happen to return that key performance indicator to green. That activity of this is the current state, and here is how I achieve it. So in the current state, I am justifying my position in stating that that indicator is that color. And then the next one being the actual physical action is a gap analysis. And that is a very powerful tool in order to help you understand your positioning on all of your key performance indicators. So I know I just wrote schedule, but what I'm actually looking for, and I'm going to go through each of the indicators and explain what I'm looking for when I choose to describe something as red, amber, or green, is firstly, is my schedule predictable? Can I understand how it's going to behave? Some common tools that I would use to determine if I'm in track are things like burn down charts, JIRA estimates, a sequence schedule, and most recently I have taken up, thanks to a fellow who works at Sledgehammer called Justin Fennick. He was a friend of mine that I worked with, who introduced me to Monte Carlo simulations. And I have here a link to the webpage where I downloaded an Excel spreadsheet and actually explained step by step how to do them. But what it essentially does is it takes the last 30 days of work and says, you have closed this number of issues. Now I'm going to run 10,000 simulations, and I'm going to tell you the % probability of time or chance that you're actually going to close in a given number of days. Really, really interesting. I'm not certain if I trust it yet, so I'm playing with it, but I highly recommend trying it and playing with it yourself. But is your schedule predictable? Number one, the schedule approach is adequate to deliver the agreed project scope. So I have written a schedule. Sometimes it could be I have a schedule on a Miro board, and that approach is enough in order to deliver. Or it could be that I have a roadmap in JIRA, and that's enough. But whatever it is that I'm doing is giving me a sense of predictability about my schedule. The next is that the work required to achieve project deliverables is well understood, and we are unaware of missing requirements. I'm also looking that no milestones are red. Milestones being packages of work that I'm delivering by a certain period of time. Often that would be something that I'm delivering to a publisher. And that if I have a milestone that's kind of shifting into the amber space, that I'm expecting to resolve that within the next reporting period. I want to know that my high-level milestone plan is in place and it's been agreed with external bodies. So if I, for example, say that I'm going to deliver something on August 5th and they're insisting that I deliver it in July, we don't have an agreement, so I can't say that my schedule is predictable. A detailed schedule is in place and is in alignment, as well as adequate to deliver the high-level milestone plan. And there's enough defined contingency in the plan to manage risk. So I will start reporting my schedule amber to red if I do not have any contingency left in my schedule. And that there are order of magnitude estimates are provided for all identified work packages. So for example, when I'm working in JIRA, if I don't have estimates in JIRA, I would be concerned, because then how do I actually know the size of the work that I'm trying to achieve? And if the schedule is behind, that there is some sort of agreement in place, or I'm taking some sort of action in order to resolve that discrepancy, and that it is raised, and that I expect that it will be easy to get approved, or it will approve. So an example of that is that if I say that I'm going to deliver in July originally, and then for some reason I'm now delivering in August, and I think that raising that to my senior stakeholders will be approved, then I can say that that's green. But if I know that it will not be approved, or if I have any concerns or even a belief that they wouldn't, I potentially would not report green. So that is your schedule predictable? Now, I have mentioned order of magnitude estimating. I prefer to use this method to several other methods that are out there. I do want to share it as a potentiality for you to try because this has been very successful for me. As I mentioned, I've been doing this for about 15 years. And the way that it works is that I don't ask people how many days because that is a point estimate. And point estimates statistically are wrong. There is about a 60% chance it will be correct, but there's a 40% chance that it will be incorrect according to research. However, if you ask a skilled individual, is that going to take you a few minutes to do, a few hours to do, a few days to do, a week to do, they will be highly accurate, more than 90% accurate in their estimates. The caveat being that the larger the estimate gets, the less precise and aware they are, and the more likely that you have to break it down. In fact, I generally, if somebody tells me that it's going to be more than a week, I say, how do we break this down and get it within a week? But if they say it's a few minutes of their time, I give them a couple hours to do it. If they say it's going to be a few hours of their time, I might give them half a day. If they say that it's going to be a few days, I'll give them 3 days to do it. And I am very highly confident that they will be able to achieve that work within that time period. And so that is order of magnitude estimating. If you try it and it works for you, please let me know. So far, again, it is my method of choice. The reason that I choose this over story points is that I can relate it to a calendar, whereas I cannot relate story points to a calendar or a t-shirt size or anything like that. The reason this works, however, is the same reason that the Fibonacci sequence and whatnot is used in Agile. And the reason that it's used that way is because how the human mind actually works. We work better comparing things. So for example, if I said, how big is a golf ball? And you try to answer that, you'll struggle a lot more than if you said, which is bigger, a golf ball or a basketball? Very, very easy to compare the two of them. So this is the functional reason that it works. The only downside is, well, I don't see it as a downside. I like to take this estimate from the person who's actually doing the work. The one thing that you kind of can miss out on, and I would highly recommend not missing out on it when you do this type of estimating, is the discussion that is had when people are doing planning poker. So that is the only negative, and you can still have a discussion and use order of magnitude estimates. So I am all the way on this side, and I would love to see the experience that you have doing it in a different way. Or if you try this, let me know if it doesn't work for you. But thank you for that. Hopefully I've explained the order of magnitude estimating. Actually, I have a little bit of the rules that I use here, so I'll mention that. The person doing the work should be the one who has the final say on the estimate and creates their buy-in on the estimate. Depending on team comfort, estimating can be done together or in isolation. However, if the team is a good team that's comfortable with one another, it's very good to get a variety of people together to discuss the estimates. Any person who's using this should look at the work as if they are doing the work themselves with all of the tools they need, but they don't need, or they don't get any help. And if the estimate is larger than a week, break it down. This will give you an effort, not a duration. So for example, if somebody tells you that, oh, it's going to take me a few hours, but that could happen over a week, so you can break it down. Duration being like what it looks like when it's actually scheduled out, as opposed to how long it just takes to do the work if you're linearly working. Also, yep, the bigger the estimate, the less people know or understand the deep intricacies of what they have to do. So thank you very much for that. We'll move to the next one. Is your capacity calculated and managed? The capacity of the team must be clearly calculated, tracked, and up to date, and no information is missing. Otherwise, I would not report it green. Capacity must be directly linked to deliverables, i.e., if I take 4 hours of time in order to do this, this is the value that will be returned as a result of spending that 4 hours. If it's not linked to a deliverable, then that capacity might not be a proper calculation for the work that you're doing. And the other thing that is important is knowing that your velocity or earned value, either one of them is an okay metric to use, is being calculated and monitored, and the outcomes are within the agreed tolerance. Earned value is something that I actually, for the first time, saw in games when I went to the chaos theory presentation earlier this week. What it is when you take the amount of time that you plan to deliver something and you put a value against that. So for example, if I were to say that it costs $100 a week for Elizabeth to work on this document. After 1 week has happened, Is that document 100% complete because I have spent $100, or is it going to go into the next week and it's going to cost me maybe $200 if it takes me into the following of the week because that's what that person costs. And so now you're comparing time against the value of the work that is being achieved, and that will tell you if you're ahead or behind schedule on day 2. So if I've spent $100 and I'm not on track to spend the curve, then I can tell that I'm over budget or over schedule before I've gotten there. And that's actually really important from like a crystal ball kind of perspective and being able to see the future. Unfortunately, earned value is a difficult concept, so I highly recommend looking it up and trying to understand it through better speaking than I might be able to get across. But if you understand what I'm talking about, fantastically. If not, please look it up and get a more rounded understanding of it. The nice thing to know, though, is that earned value is reflected in velocity. So if you are used to calculating velocity, that too says this is the amount of work that we're getting for the amount of time that we are putting in, and it's just a different kind of way of looking at the same thing. In any case, in order to be green on your project, you should be calculating your capacity consistently in some value or in some manner. Next, I like to ask, is my scope stable? For me, this means that firstly, I have an approved objective, and I use a tool called a project charter. The project charter is a 1 or 2 page document that lays out what it is that I'm trying to do, what are the critical success factors according to senior management, what are the key constraints, initial risk profile, and what is my authority on the project to actually do this work? Can I direct the team? Can I make decisions under $5,000, et cetera? I need some sort of statement that is a clear agreement that I can use to align the team on what it is that we're doing. That is the first step to saying that my scope is stable. The next is that there is a statement in that charter that says explicitly what you plan to do and what you plan not to do. So for example, if I'm going to build a game, I might make a few genre declarations, like we are not a multiplayer game, that we're not intending to go down that path, that we intend to, I don't know, it's going to be roguelike and it's going to have iterations and so on and so forth. But you kind of want to have a couple of high-level structure things that will tell people what we're exploring, what we're not exploring, and that can change over time, but you want to have that kind of stake in the sand and start putting stakes in the sand in order to build structure around what you're going to do. Scope assumptions and exclusions should both be clear and agreed upon with your team and external stakeholders. The boundaries of the project need to be clear, documented, and agreed. That means that they're not frequently being questioned. So one of the things that I have noted is pretty common in games is that you make a decision and then people come and they continuously ask the same question and kind of reopen the question. That is what I'm talking about here when I say that the project boundaries are clear and agreed and they're not frequently being questioned. You have some sort of process to describe decision making, and once a decision has been made, it is entered in a way that is shared back and able to be looked up. So an example of that might be a decision register in Confluence, or an announcement on Slack saying we've made this decision and where you're sharing that. Agreed changes are implemented into project plans. So this is one of the things that we often forget is once we've made the decision, sometimes we continue on and we forget to update our schedule, forget to update our capacity planning and so on. So one of the things that I'm looking at to say whether or not my scope is stable is whether or not I've taken the time to actually implement any changes that have happened to the scope into other plans. And that requests for change are not coming too frequently for the project to safely manage and process. So if you're being bombarded with constant change, it may be an activity that you need to do in order to slow down, just so that way you can implement the impacts of those changes and those decisions. And finally, requests for change are not being actioned prior to approval. So for example, if somebody says we have a great idea and then they go off and they build it and they don't actually circle in and make sure that they're following the decision-making pattern that you've agreed in the team, that would indicate to me that my scope's not stable and I might need to take some action on making that part of my scope secure. Next is, are your stakeholders engaged and supportive? So they can be engaged and the opposite of supportive. In order to know if my stakeholders are engaged and supportive, I ask, firstly, is there a clear and effective escalation path for project issues? So one of the things that we start off with when I said amber is it's within my authority and ability to solve, but if it's red, I might be looking to someone else to assist. And that is me going to an escalation path and knowing that they themselves can help me, probably will help me, and have the ability to do so. Another thing that I'm looking for to see whether or not my stakeholders are engaged and supportive is, are all of the required and or appropriate stakeholder groups effectively represented and engaged? So this is the classic, I'm putting together meetings or I'm setting up a communications plan and I'm trying to set up an operating rhythm and I forget a critical person that needs to be in the room. So am I generally getting that right? Another one is, all stakeholders that are in there understand their roles and responsibilities within the project and are acting correctly according to their role. Some of the tools that I would use and make sure that that has to do is, like in a team playbook, I might have a roles matrix and responsibilities statements. There should be someone who's clearly identified and assigned to make certain types of decisions. So that could be a creative director who's making directive decisions, or it could be a designer, it could be a product manager, it could be very different in each of different games and different studios. But what's important is that you have someone there that can provide the strategic direction and the framework that the game team is playing within, and can provide feedback on what is correct and what needs to be adjusted. And finally, that the person who is nominated for that role is the correct person for the job, has the necessary authority to do that, and they understand that that is their role in the project. And they should be supportive and provide necessary and timely decisions, the removal of roadblocks outside of the producer's authority, and often resourcing, such as personnel funding, as required. And then finally, I would like to look that I myself have performed a stakeholder analysis and determined how to engage each and manage each group or individual. So if I have critical stakeholders, I might need to know, how am I going to communicate with them? How often am I going to communicate with them? And are they consistently taken along for the journey? That aspect of taking those people along for the journey is the part that gets the buy-in and ensures that they're going to be supportive when the time comes. And finally, am I regularly engaging my seniors in order to make sure that they understand where we're going and that they're on board? So that is how I ensure that my stakeholders are engaged and supportive, and what I'm looking for when I am scoring my KPIs. The next one is the one that I get the most questions about, and it's whether or not the team is high performing. And how do you actually know if your team is high performing? Well, here are the things that I'm looking for. The first one is that all team members required to deliver the current phase of the project are assigned. That means I am not trying to deliver something and I have only one engineer or no engineers if I'm in production. But I might be very early on in ideation and I might not need QA, for example. The team member mix contains all the skills required to deliver the project. I really like this tool that I call a team playbook that contains the following information. It should have the project charter, the roles and responsibilities, team agreements, key processes, such as what your design process is and who owns it, escalation paths, and the agreed decision-making process that you have with your team. Another thing that I look for to see if my team is high-performing is, are assigned team members technically capable of completing their tasks and express the confidence to do so? Team members are behaving as if they understand their project role, the deliverables, and their responsibilities. Another thing that I look for is team members are proactively assisting one another without getting in one another's way. Team members are adequately engaged in discussion as required for planning, resolving issues, raising risks, and so on. Another one is that the team has the psychological safety to raise issues, and team members themselves are acting in a manner in accordance to psychological safety. And that the team both regularly and honestly assesses their position and appropriately takes action based on their assessment. So that's like, we are having, maybe not retrospectives, but we are occasionally sitting down and talking to each other about how we're going and what we're going to do in order to solve problems. And finally, team members have confidence in the project and or the solution. Some of the tools that I like to use in order to ensure that the team is high performing are one-on-ones, occasional engagement surveys, and retrospectives. The next metric is, are your project risks managed? One of the things that I'm looking for is, has the project team spent some time identifying the risks? Are the risks continually identified as part of your processes? So if you are three-fourths of the way through delivery and something comes up, have you actually recorded it and gone through the same process that you would have with any other risk? Once risks are prioritized, are they rated? Or excuse me, once risks are identified, are they rated and prioritized? Are the unacceptable risks, either they're very likely or highly impactful, are they mitigated? And are your mitigation plans actioned? So it's one thing to make a plan, and it's another thing to actually take the steps in order to make sure that that plan has been done. And once mitigated, is residual risk calculated, and is your risk position still acceptable? And are senior stakeholders aware of the associated risks, and have they accepted that that is the risk position of the project? Now, I have actually got a real example of the next one, which is, are your project issues closing? Again, I want to thank Summerfall for allowing me to use real examples of actual risk registers that were used on projects. In order to determine whether or not my risks are being proactively managed and it's within where it should be, the first thing I look is, are issues proactively sought regardless of where they might be found? That is, any team member can raise an issue whether or not I agree that it's an issue, and that I will take it through the same process of closure as I would any other issue. Issues need to be systemically logged, assigned, and follow up until successful closure. Issues are reviewed on an agreed cyclical basis, which is adequate to support your mitigation tactics. So for me, again, that's typically weekly, but it could be fortnightly. And that your issues mitigation tactics are defined and agreed with the team, and that issues are consistently closing within a reasonable period of time. So I have on projects had issues where I reported it amber and I felt perfectly adequate in order to solve the problem, and 2 weeks later it was still open despite my attempts. At that point in time I had to admit to myself that maybe this was not amber and it was actually red. Now, what I have up here is, on the left you can see the issue description. That usually describes what's going on, what's the impact of this problem existing, and I'll usually say who is it responsible for owning it. So it could be me or it could be a member in the team, because not all problems or issues that exist are my responsibility to solve. I will note who raised it and also the date it was raised, and typically I will note who closed it. But one of the other things I do is that I put in the date, and you can see like a weekly update, particularly on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the last risk. You can see where I put the date, and then I had another date where I had created the update, and so I put the most recent comment right above it. And that's the way that I can actually see what all the actions were that were taken over time in order to close the issue. All right. One of the final ones that's very specific to the games industry that I brought in is the game healthy? In order to determine that the game is healthy, I want the game build to be appropriate for what its current stage of delivery is. So if I'm prototyping, I should have a stable prototype, but I wouldn't expect to have a whole game. But if I'm in beta, then I probably shouldn't still be feature solving. I should be just delivering content, for example. The game is fulfilling the purpose of its delivery phase. The game is playable and stable when played. Game optimization is frequently tested and forward managed. Tech debt is proactively managed, minimal, and not affecting delivery. Game features are testable against a game design. The game is likely to be perceived to have value for the target customer. In some instances, I've had like a game lead that would report on this, and I wouldn't actually do that reporting. The game is experienced recent playtesting, and the results of playtesting are hitting the desired metrics. Now, I'm going to confess that I accidentally overwrote a slide, and that was the benefits realization that I mentioned very, very early on. The reason that I have benefits realization as a metric that I monitor is because that is usually something that's going on outside of the project that can undercut the project. For example, the market has changed and the game that we're working on no longer benefits the market. Or the business itself has had something come up. And those are the things that tend to hit us producers by surprise if we're not monitoring them. So those are the two things I'm looking for, is market change and that we're still going to achieve the objective that we originally stated when we said that we were going to release this particular piece of work. And then finally, putting it all together, you want to identify, like the framework that I'm using is that I have my key performance indicators and you want to identify what yours will be. The 7 that I have given you are very standard project management ones from time and ages of old, but they are tried and true. If I, on a weekly basis, sit down and say, is my schedule predictable? Is my scope stable? Are my stakeholders engaged? And I can, with my hand on my heart, say that yes, they are green, everything is good, fine. But if I have a reason to believe that they are amber, and then I say to myself, what needs to happen to return it to green? At that point in time, I have identified the crystalline actions that I can take and get ahead of the problem. So I would highly recommend that you look at these 7 KPIs and then include other KPIs, what you need individually for your projects that would help you get ahead of anything that you could see. Again, you should review everything on a regular cadence using something like the red, amber, green formula, and then perform that gap analysis and shake out your action items. At that stage, we are now just slightly before the end, so I want to thank you all for coming. I hope that this has helped you figure out some ways in order to get ahead of what could be coming down the pipeline in your projects. And now we have some time for some questions. Yes?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really interested in the order of magnitude estimation. I'm actually interested in trying that out myself, actually. But just a mechanical question on that. I think you mentioned that you're using GCAP for most of your projects. Are you actually sort of converting those into points to track, or using time estimations like the thing in GCAP for that? And then how are you doing burn downs on top of that as well?
I'm kind of torn between telling you what I really do and what I think you should do. I'm going to answer that in what my pie in the sky and what I'd like to be doing is, and then I'll tell you what I'm really doing and just acknowledge that there is a gap there. So what I really like to do is I want to capture the entire chain. And so what I would have is something like design effort, engineering effort, tech art effort, like all the listed disciplines. And then in there, I would have a predetermined drop-down box of not yet estimated, not required at all, so they've estimated so they don't have to do anything, or minutes, hours, days, a week, maybe a fortnight, or too big. That is what I'd like to see. And then what I do is I go back and I add that up and I create my own estimate and create my own scheduling based off of that. I don't actually want the team to see the numbers, because once the team sees the numbers, then they start to think in the numbers, and then they're starting to think in point estimates rather than orders of magnitude. That is my ideal state. I'm not yet there. Right now, what we have been doing is sitting down with an Excel spreadsheet, filling in the same thing, and then converting them. And then using the conversions that I internally create, which is if it's a few minutes, I'll give them an hour. If it's a few hours, I'll give them half a day. If it's a few days, I'll give them 3 days. Actually, I think I have a 1-day estimate. I think if they say it's half a day, I'll give them 1 day, and so on and so forth. So that is theory versus reality, and hopefully that's helpful.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That was a really good talk. I want to go back to the idea of capacity and how to measure it that you were speaking about, and how all your measure of capacity should tie back to a deliverable.
Yeah.
It feels like to me in a lot of my projects, and this goes along with tying everything to a JIRA epic, is that there's tasks that need to be done, but they don't fit neatly in a drawn line to a deliverable. And I'm talking about things like kind of research or updating documentation or things like that need to be done, but don't contribute to a particular deliverable. And I feel like they suck black holes of time that make you estimate incorrectly. And suddenly you're like, oh, I thought we were going to be able to accomplish all this in this sprint, but we didn't. And it's because there's all this kind of unrecorded work that's done.
Yep.
So how do you recommend approaching something like that?
So I do that in 2 ways, but the first thing is I'm curious when you say that you can't tie those back to deliverables, because frequently I do. So it's not surprising to me that someone has to do some research before they actually have to put code down and that sort of thing, and we allow for the time. But the other thing is that I ultimately, calculating the capacity is the first step, because that just tells you like how big that particular task will be. But there's overheads, because people, for example, go to the bathroom during the day, they have meetings, they go to lunch, all that sort of stuff. And so when I'm calculating capacity, I'm usually aiming to have about 60 to 80% of their whole capacity turn towards work. So I do assume that there's an overhead there. And I am a very visual person, so I like to play Tetris. And what I do is I create a schedule, and I literally have a box that's the size of hours, a box that's the size of days, and I will have them pick up the box, stick it on the schedule, and type it in, or type in what that task is, and then I'll break it out. And then I will put in like a day or two of meetings, because I know that over the week they're gonna have a day or two of meetings. And if they're a lead, I might actually block out 2 days just for lead duties and that sort of thing. And I usually I feel that out by starting to give them about 20%, and then over time, just like in retrospectives and stuff like that, saying, hey, are you really pressed? Like, are you doing okay? Do I need to give you more time or less time, and adjusting on that. The other thing about capacity that I actually haven't mentioned, because this wasn't actually about calculating capacity, it was more saying making sure that you do have capacity and that your capacity is linked down to the things that you're delivering, is that if you only calculate capacity and you haven't sequenced those events, you may actually find yourself in a bad situation, because a to-do list is not a plan. And I'll give you an example of that. If I have 5 artists and 5 days until deadline, theoretically, my capacity, if you do the calculation, is 25 days, right? But I could very easily say, hey, every artist has to do an asset that's 3 days each. And I need 6 assets done. And 3 times 6 is 18. Theoretically, that's under capacity. But does anybody, can you mentally see where that's gonna go wrong for you? Because if you only have 5 artists, that means 1 artist has to do 2. And if there's 3 days each, now somebody's at 6 days, and that's gonna go over your deadline. So capacity requires both the calculation of the capacity, and it requires the sequencing to actually be able to validate that. At some stage, maybe my next presentation will be on all about calculating capacity. Have I sufficiently answered the question?
Yes, so I think the kind of buffer time is
Excellent. Yes?
Thank you. Thank you for a really cohesive, kind of encompassing perspective on production here. I'm really curious about how you've gone about wedding production-focused frameworks to general company ways of working. Because a company isn't just the production, it's also the company's culture, or the founder who's kind of off doing his own thing, or the very senior people who say, yes, I'll obey your thing, but kind of don't really. How does it work in reality where you're building this beautiful, legitimately very thorough framework, but it has to live every day?
That is an excellent question. I love it. The first thing is
Can you tell we're battle scarred?
Yes. The first thing is that monitoring my KPIs is something I can do off the back of my desk, and nobody needs to see it. They don't need to know what I said my return to greens are. Mind you, it's a very powerful tool, because this type of analysis gives me a foundation to have conversations. But in reality, what do? Well, firstly, I do monitor those things, and I may or may not make it very public. Generally speaking, I tend to be transparent, so most of the time my team knows that this is what I'm driving to. But when I first join an organization, I don't whip out all the frameworks and just say, hey, we're doing this now. What I typically do is I sit down and I listen, and I think, oh, yeah, okay, I think I have something that might solve that. Oh yeah, I hear that one too, and I try to I close my mouth, open my ears, and I start listening. And then I start, when I hear the pain that the team is having, I pull something out, say, what do you think we try this? What do you think we try that? And that is usually, it gets me the permission. And then when I have enough friendship, permission, social capital and whatnot, I'm more and more able to roll this type of thing out. And often teams, when they see the benefit of it or feel the benefit of it, are far more engaged with it. And the other thing that I try to do is that whereas this is a theory and some of this stuff is stuff that I do all the time, so there has not been a project that I have been on probably for the last 12 years where I have not monitored my KPIs, I try not to think that I actually know everything. Because there's oftentimes, things like doing Monte Carlo, I had no idea about that. When I was doing the research for this, I went and spoke to other producers, and I was like, hey, what are you doing in your studio? And they're like, oh, I do this. And I'm like, I have never heard of that. Okay, let's go do some research and whatnot. Your teams can solve problems. So I let people who solve problems get the hell out of the way. It's less work for me, you know? Have I answered that question sufficiently? Thank you. And what a wonderful question. Any other questions? No? All right. Well, oh, yes, Cass.
Wait, I'm coming.
Something that you sort of touched on briefly was like, and I think sort of comes a little bit under like capacity resources, was budgeting, and that's something that in past jobs I haven't really had to think about a lot, like because someone else was sort of covering the budgeting, but there's been a lot more focus on on budgeting the team and making sure that like we're coming in under budget and spending our time that way. And that's not something that I'm super familiar with, but I'm sort of learning. Do you know if there's like any resources or anything that are helpful for that?
Yeah, I have some. Why don't we meet up after this? But, so firstly, with regards to budgeting, it behaves a lot like capacity management because it's another type of capacity that you're managing. One of the key things for budgeting is that you need to have your plan understood. Then you kind of need to monitor your actuals compared to your plan and like where you're at compared to where you want to be. And another very key important thing for budgeting, and actually I did have a budgeting slide that I took out of because I think that only a very small portion of games producers are actually working with budgets. But for those of you who are, it's a really, really good experience, is contingency. And whether or not you actually have calculated your contingency and that you're within contingency and that contingency is enough to manage the perceived risk that you have on your project. I actually do have a slide about that, and I will share it with you. Hit me up.
Thank you.
All right. It seems like that may be all for today, so I'll return some time. Is that what we'll do? Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful day, and embrace GCAP.